afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Concept Booster series that is brought to you by IPMAT VARC. Guys, in today's video, we are going to take up one more concept of VARC, which is parajumble questions, and we will try to understand how these parajumble questions are supposed to be solved. Now, understand one thing with respect to your preparation for IPMAT 26. Just understand one thing. In IPMAT Indore's paper is giving you 45 questions. Just remember there are around 4 to 5 questions that come from Parajumble. In other examination, that is IPMAT Rohtak, JIPMAT, Christ or SET for that matter, you may or may not have questions of Parajumbles. So let us get started and understand what Parajumble questions are and what is the strategy to solve these questions in the most effective way by making it sure that you solve these questions in less time. So let us try and understand what these questions are. Right, now what are parajumble questions? Parajumble questions are questions where a set of sentences is given. So basically what happens in a parajumble question is that you have a set of sentences given. These sentences can range from minimum 4 sentences, maximum it can go up to 6 or 8 sentences, although the recent pattern is that you have got minimum 4 sentences or maximum it can go up to 6 sentences. So parajumbles are questions where a set of statement is given in jumbled order. So that is to say that they are in the incorrect order and you need to rearrange them to form a coherent and logical paragraph. Parajumble questions are basically questions of language plus logic. So when you solve a parajumble question, you need to understand that you are basing your answers on certain logic to arrive at an answer. The number of sentences is usually 4 to 5. So if you look at the current pattern of IPMAT Indore, they give you generally 5 sentences, although you cannot rule out 4 sentences as well. Otherwise, if there is a deviation from these standard practices, then we have no idea. But it's just that 4 sentences to 5 sentences is the norm in the last couple of years, and that is what we are expecting for next year as well. Now, when you talk about parajumble questions, what is being tested in these questions? So, why do you have parajumble questions in the first place? Just understand to check your ability to understand the logical flow of ideas. Guys, please understand parajumble questions are questions of logic. So, there is a way to solve these questions. There is a logic behind all those questions that you are solving. And when you solve these questions, these are the questions that you solve on the basis of structure, mandatory pair and so on. So it's all about the logic that we're talking about. To test reading and comprehension skills, one more skill that is being checked with respect to your parajumble question is they are checking your reading skills plus how do you comprehend the text. So that is again the pointer. Then to evaluate cohesion and coherence in writing. So when you have 2 sentences that go together or when you have 3 sentences that form a cluster. So basically what we are looking at, what exactly is the logic behind solving these questions and what is the rationale behind understanding how do you group the sentences into a particular sequence. So it checks your logical ability, it checks your flow of ideas, it checks your logic and interpretation. Now, common types of parajumble questions. Broadly speaking, when you talk about IPMAT preparation, there are 2 types of parajumble questions that you can see. One is without options. So when you talk about IPMAT Indore, they only give you 4 sentences or 5 sentences with no options. So you don't have an option here. So that is type 1A questions. Then there are certain examinations which do give you options as well. So it's about choosing the current sequence from the given choices, IPMAT Rohtak, JIPMAT, SET, Christ University and so on. So remember, as of now, there are 2 types of pattern which is most favored here, which is one with options and one without option. Although the more or less similar process is followed in answering those questions, but yes, if you do have option, it becomes slightly easier to come at a right answer. So remember that. Then strategies to solve parajumble questions. So how do you go about solving a parajumble question? There is a certain pro forma that you can actually follow. First, of course, we talk about find the opening sentence. So out of these 4 sentences or 5 sentences, understand one thing, that it's always an edge to those individuals who can figure out the opening sentence of the paragraph. So usually introduces the topic. So when you talk about figuring out the opening sentence of a particular paragraph, it is something that introduces the topic. So that is one hint. Then you say does not start with pronouns like he, it, they. Although there are exceptions to this, but as a general rule, we generally don't have opening sentences starting with pronouns like he, it, they, unless context is already set. We will discuss that in the later videos, but just for the understanding, understand that you generally don't have opening sentences starting with these words. And it is a broad or a general statement. It is a statement that gives you a broader idea. It is a statement that gives you a general idea. So I'm sure if you practice these questions, you will figure out in some time that what exactly feels like an opening statement and which does not. So first thing that you should keep in mind is that when you read these 4 sentences, try to figure out the opening sentence. Second, identifying the closing sentence. Now this is just opposite to what the previous pointer was. So talking about the closing sentence, it is something that concludes or summarizes the idea. So something that concludes an idea, something that summarizes the idea is most likely to be your closing sentence and may give a final opinion, result or forward looking statement. So it might give you a final opinion on a discussion that is taking place in a parajumble question. So not always easy to understand the closing sentence, but yes, out of the closing one and the opening sentence, it is much easier to identify the opening sentence as opposed to the closing sentence. Now look for mandatory pairs. Now when you solve parajumble question, of course we look for mandatory pairs. Now what these mandatory pairs are? Mandatory pairs are the set of 2 statements that go together. So when you're solving a parajumble question, remember if you can figure out the mandatory pair, it will help you to sequence your sentences together. So sentences that naturally stick together. For example, there is a sentence that gives you cause and a sentence that gives you effect. So it's very normal to understand that the cause will precede your effect. Similarly, let's say there is a problem and solution mentioned. So a sentence that gives you a problem and a sentence that gives you a solution to that problem, of course, forms a mandatory pair. Similarly, there is a question or a statement that gives you a question and there is a statement that gives you an answer. Then of course, question precedes the statement that gives you the answer. So there are some mandatory pairs that you should always keep in mind because that helps you to label 2 sentences together, which would help you to identify which sentences are gelling with other sentences. So remember, cause and effect, problem, solution, question, answer. Although this appears to be very simple, I have come across students who tell me that it's not always easy to identify as to what exactly is the cause and what exactly is the effect. So what I tell students is that it is all about practicing as many questions as you can, because Parajumble has got a very little theory in terms of answering the questions. It is by practicing a lot of questions that you understand what is the pattern of answering, what forms a mandatory pair, what does not form a mandatory pair. So I'm sure even if you're not very confident with respect to these spotting the mandatory pairs, but if you practice a decent number of questions, you will identify the pattern of answers, and that exactly is going to help you to answer your questions in a best possible way. So remember, cause and effect, problem, solution, question and answer, they form a mandatory pair. It is highly possible that there might be a sentence between these 2 sentences, but you would not have a case where the answer is given first and the question is given later. So that does not form the logical flow of ideas. So remember these 3 pointers. Then we talk about tracking pronouns and connectors. Now again guys, this is very important. In most of your parajumble question, you will often come across pronoun indicator. So if there is a sentence that mentions a pronoun and there is a sentence that mentions a noun for that pronoun, understand noun would come first and the sentence with a pronoun would follow later. So words like this, that, these, those, therefore, however, moreover, signal, links, so you have got these connectors as well, and these connectors are specific in the sense that most of the time they are not the opening sentence of your paragraph. So if you have connectors like but, if you have connectors like thus, if you have connectors like moreover, however, so this signals a discussion of an idea in continuity, so most likely not going to be your opening sentence. Pronouns refer back to nouns mentioned earlier. So if you happen to spot a noun in one sentence and then you have a pronoun in another sentence which is mentioning or referring to the same noun, then you understand that the noun comes first and the pronoun comes later. So this is again a kind of mandatory pair that you can look forward to. Always understand when you're solving a parajumble question, most of these questions would give you now pronoun signals. So if you can understand what pronoun is used for which noun, it will help you to narrow down your options to what forms a mandatory pair. Now, chronological or the logical flow. Chronology is in the sense of time sequence. So what I tell students is, in some of your questions, some passages follow time sequence. So first, next and finally, or you precisely say that past, present and future. So let's say there is a sentence which talks about the 18th century and there is a sentence which talks about the year 2025. It is highly likely that the sentence that mentions 18th century, which is the past tense, that of course precedes a statement that gives you year 2025. Although there is no thumb rule like this, but in most of the cases, this is what the preferred sequence is. So you start with the past, then you come to the present, and then you talk about future. So in the questions where the sequence is followed, people do get their answers. So you should always keep it as an option that if you have a past reference, a present reference and a future reference, you can go in that sequence which is starting from past to present to future. Then others follow reasonings like idea and explanation, example and conclusion. So this is again a kind of information look that we have in these questions. So you can go for idea and explanation as well, plus you can go for example and conclusion as well. Now, apart from this, there is again a very important hint that is mostly overlooked by students, which is the use of articles. So I often tell students that please make it sure that these parameters or these indicators are taken care of when you are solving a parajumble question. Now, how is the concept of article to be used? This is to say that when you talk about a certain noun for the very first time, you make use of indefinite articles a or an. When you refer to the same noun the second time, you make use of article the, because the becomes specific. So let's say there is a sentence which gives you a house and there is a sentence which mentions the house. So now understand, the noun is same, which is house in sentence A and house in sentence B, but then a or an sentence will precede the sentence that gives you the. So remember, articles also help you to narrow down to your mandatory pairs as to which sentence comes first and which sentence comes later. So keep this in mind. So it's the use of articles. Then transition words. This is what I was talking about initially as well, because when you have these transition words, now what are these transition words? Transition words are statements that signal a change of an idea, right? So transition words also offer a reliable clue to forming sentence sequences. In most cases, the sentences with transition words are generally not the opening sentences of the paragraph. So one specific quality of these transition words are that the sentences which have got these transition words, they generally are not the opening statement of your sequence. So transition words like since, also, yet, but, though, although, thus, moreover, nevertheless, on the other hand, hence, etc. So if you follow these words, if you remember these words, I'm sure you will be understanding that all of these sentences where the transition words are used, they are most likely not going to be your opening statement. So this helps you to narrow down your choices as to what exactly can the start of the sentence could be. So just remember that thing as well. Transition words help you in that sense. Now let's look at a sample parajumble question, just keeping in mind when you keep in your mind these basic principles of solving a parajumble questions. Let's have a look at this question. So try to figure out which sentence comes first, which comes later. So let's just read this out. It says, social media platforms have transformed the way political campaigns are run. B says these platforms allow candidates to directly reach millions of voters instantly. C says, however, they have also raised concerns about misinformation and manipulation. And D says traditional rallies and television debates no longer hold the same dominance. Guys, when you're solving a parajumble question, first thing of course is that you have to read these sentences to get a hang of idea as to what is being discussed in the question. So if you have read these statements, I'm sure you would have figured out by now that this sentence C mentions however, which is a transition word. This is not going to be your opening statement, so this will be cancelled out as an opening statement. Then B says these platforms. Now look at the pronoun usage that you have got here. So it refers to these platforms, and where do we talk about platforms? We have talked about social media platforms in A, right? And D says traditional rallies and television debates no longer hold the same dominance. This is a discussion that is happening in the middle of the entire discussion process. So if you look at these four sentences, a sentence that can probably start is sentence A because it's a generic statement. It's a statement that gives you a general idea. So it says social media platforms have transformed the way political campaigns are run. And then you say these platforms. So platforms forms here, platforms comes here. So A and B forms a mandatory pair. Then you talk about D1, which says traditional rallies and television debates no longer hold the same dominance. So it talks about what? Same dominance, which is after sentence number B. So D would come here. And then you would conclude with sentence C, which is, however, they have also raised concern about misinformation and manipulation. So if you look at the ideal sequence for this question, that would be A, B, D, and C. So this is how you actually go about solving a parajumble question. Although I always feel that parajumble questions are questions of logic. So the more you practice, the better confidence you would have in yourself to answer those questions. And I'm sure once you practice a certain number of questions, you really get a hang of an idea as to what forms a mandatory pair, what does not form a mandatory pair. So just make it sure that you remember the basics and you also remember how these questions are to be solved. Now, so as the question that we solved here, so A sets the theme. So social media platforms have transformed. So what exactly is the next one? It says logically flows by explaining how. So you have A and B coming together. D shifts the comparison with older methods where we were talking about traditional rallies, and C becomes the cautionary note, which is, however, they have also raised concern. So this is how you go about arranging the sequence of these questions, and that is how you have the answer. Just remember one thing, guys. Once you know the parameters of forming the mandatory pair, identifying the opening statement, identifying the closing statement, and you practice a lot of questions, it does give you a sense of security in terms of accuracy of your answers. Now let's quickly summarize as to what all things we have discussed in this short session. It is mostly about what are the indicators that you have to keep in mind when you're solving a parajumble question. First, of course, is the opening sentence. As I said and mentioned before, that opening sentence is a sentence that is broad and general in its connotation. Then you have articles. Just remember and with the same noun and the with the same noun. And precedes the statement which is giving you the as a same statement. So if you have got a textbook and you have got the textbook, so a sentence with a textbook precedes the sentence with the textbook. So this is a simple rule of articles that we use, but sometimes it can help you immensely to answer the questions. Then of course we go for noun and pronoun sequence. I told you, when you spot a pronoun in any of the sentences, your idea has to be to look for the noun that it is referring to. So noun and pronoun of course forms a pair. So keep that in mind. Remember the chronology. So you start with past, then you go to the present, and then you go to the future. Although you may not have all the three sequences in the same question, if you do have that, then the traditional pattern that we follow is past followed by present followed by future. So that is how you can relate it. Then of course you go for transition words, and transition words most of the time are not your opening sentence, although there are exceptions to that we will discuss in the later videos where we practice some advanced question. But as a very general rule, in terms of the easy questions and the moderate questions, most of these sentences with a transition word are not your opening statements. Then of course you can go for cause and effect, I mentioned earlier, but then you will have to practice by saying that you are able to identify which sentence gives you cause and which sentence gives you effect. So cause and effect is a very healthy thing that we take as a sequence, but then identifying what exactly is the cause and what exactly is the effect, that requires an amount of practice. So cause and effect is something that you should keep in mind. Then of course you move from general to specific. So let's say there is a sentence which talks about the prevalence of the disease of diabetes across the world, and then you mention a case of UK in particular. So something that gives you a case in the world is again something which is general. A sentence that gives you the occurrence of this disease in UK particularly, so that becomes specific. So you move from general to specific. Then you have question and answer, again the same way. So a sentence that gives you questions, a sentence that give you answer, so you have a mandatory pair. Then you have problem and solution. By the same logic, a sentence that gives you problem, let's say there is a sentence which gives you air pollution in Delhi, and there are other sentences related to it, so you will have a problem statement coming first, followed by a solution statement. Similarly, you can have hypothesis and example. So let's say I talk about the problem of drug addiction in youth, and then I talk about the scenario especially in Punjab. So of course that would be the case. So hypothesis and example forms a pace. Then you have abbreviations and acronyms. We have not discussed this, but this also gives you a clue. So let's say there is a sentence which mentions IPL, and there is a sentence which mentions Indian Premier League. So a sentence with the full name, which is Indian Premier League, will definitely precede a statement that gives you IPL. In case Indian Premier League sentence is missing, then of course you can start with IPL. But if a sentence gives you the abbreviation and something that gives you the full form, it is the full form that precedes the short form. Then you have the closing sentence. The last thing that we are looking at, sometimes you would be able to look at the sentence and say that this forms or is most likely to be the closing sentence because it summarizes the paragraph or it concludes the paragraph. So these are the indicators that we are looking at. Just make it sure that you are clear with your basics and you practice as many questions as possible. Right, and the rest all depends on how much you practice regularly. Once you understand these basics of Parajumbles, understand one thing students, that it's all about practice. So I told you that general comes first, specific comes later. But to identify as to what categorizes as a general statement and what functions as a specific statement needs practice from your side. So these are the parameters that we generally look at when you're talking about solving a Parajumble questions. Get your basics straight, and then it is all about how many questions you can practice regularly so that it gives you the kind of confidence that you're looking for. So I hope I have given you some clarity in terms of how these Parajumble questions are to be solved. But at a very broader level, just understand Parajumble questions, because they are questions of logic, they test how the flow of ideas move in a certain direction in the particular question. So just remember these things that we have just discussed. Pause the video where you are unable to understand a certain idea, but just make it sure that the pointers we talked about, so you have problem, solution, you have cause and effect, you have hypothesis and example. These pairs are very clear in your head, so that when next time when you solve the question, you know how these questions are to be answered. So with this, we come to the conclusion of this short video that was concept booster. We are doing these series for all the subjects, all the 3 subjects. We are doing it for VARC, we are doing it for DILR, we are also doing it for Quant. So just make it sure that you are following these series and your basic concepts across the 3 sections is getting clear. We will be back with more such contents. Keep following us, keep working harder, keep learning smarter, and I'm sure you are good to go with your preparation for IPMAT 2026. Thank you so much and have a good day.